Hi everyone, this is going to be our 9th mini lecture for our 13-ish chapter on the anatomy of the nervous system. We are going to finish up our general discussion of the cerebrum, and then we will actually start talking about integrated brain functions, so putting together all of these different little bits and regions and areas and functions into sort of a bigger picture of how do we think, how do we form memories, how do we learn. We'll talk about those higher functions of the brain. I'm going to start by reminding everybody that we have both gray and white matter as part of the cerebrum. The gray matter is primarily going to compose that cerebral cortex, so that's that sort of outer or surface of the brain is going to be gray matter, and then we have sort of those deep pockets of gray matter, which are our basal nuclei and the limbic system. But much of the cerebrum is actually going to be made of white matter. So white matter is composed of glia and myelinated fibers. So we have those glial cells or those neuroglia. I'm actually going to write that since that's how we've been referring to them. And we're going to have myelinated fibers. That's what makes this white matter. Unmyelinated appears gray, and that's the difference between having a myelinated or unmyelinated axon. So the role of the white matter in the cerebrum is going to be to transmit signals from one area of the cerebrum to another area, or from the cerebrum to another location in the brain, so to a lower brain center. We do this in 3 different ways. So we have projection tracts, we have commissarial tracts, and we have association tracts. Each of these tracts is going to be comprised of these bundles of white matter, and they're going to carry information from one region to another. So we define them based on where the messages are going to or coming from. So the first one on here we have listed are projection tracts. Projection tracts are shown in these images, or at least let's start with this frontal image down here, this frontal section. The projection tracts are these green lines. Those are demonstrating or showing some of the pathways that our projection tracts are going to take. So they extend vertically from higher to lower brain regions. And so their job is going to be to carry information between the cerebrum and the body. Okay, so not only are we moving out of a higher brain region, so out of the cerebrum, but we're going all the way down to the lower brain and actually out or in the spinal cord. So examples of these would be the corticospinal tract, which helps carry motor signals from the cerebrum down to the actual muscles in the body that are carrying out those commands. So they're actually doing the moving. The next type of white matter tract we have are commissarial tracts. And again, a tract is just a bundle or sort of a grouping of these axons that are myelinated, and they form these sort of white regions. You can literally see in this brain, right, we have our gray matter around the edge, that's our cerebral cortex. We have our nuclei, so sort of deep in here, these pockets of gray matter that are surrounded by white matter. And then all of this space, which appears lighter, is that white matter. So this sort of region of white matter down either side as we head out towards the brainstem, those are going to be the projection tracts. We also have commissarial tracts, so that's shown here in yellow. The commissarial tracts is going to be when one hemisphere of the cerebrum is communicating with the other. So a great example of a commissarial tract is going to be the corpus callosum, which I said in the last lecture that I was going to point out when I saw. Well, here's a great time to point it out. So here we've divided the brain in 2 down our big longitudinal fissure. This sort of like almost ear-shaped structure that is white and very obvious is going to be the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum holds the 2 hemispheres together. It also allows communication to occur between the 2 hemispheres. So we can send messages from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere, we're going to do that through the corpus callosum. So cross between cerebral hemispheres, that's going to be communication from hemisphere to hemisphere. There are other commissural tracts, and they are, for example, we have the posterior commissure or the anterior commissure. Those are both commissural tracts. All right, and our last type of white matter tract or bundle of white matter axons are going to be our association tracts. Seeing as how we're going sort of down in terms of distance, right? We have all the way from higher to lower brain regions here with our projection tracts. We have from hemisphere to hemisphere here. Our association tracts are sort of our shortest distance. They are traveling to regions within the same hemisphere. So at this point, we're not even leaving the hemisphere, but we may carry messages from place to place. So when we look on here, we can see these little red lines are taking information from here to here, or from here maybe over to here. Within a particular hemisphere, those are going to be our association tracts. So the association tracts are either long or short. The difference is going to be whether they're staying within a lobe or traveling between lobes. So long fibers are going between lobes, so maybe we have from our occipital lobe here into our temporal lobe, or we have short fibers, so they're just staying, very close and within those, within, the frontal lobe here. So the other thing that I'll sort of show is when we're looking at the projection tracts on this frontal view, it looks like they sort of come up and stop, but then when we look at them from the sagittal view, we can see that they do extend pretty much all the way up into this cerebral tissue. And so they are going to carry messages from this very edge all the way down to the body. Okay. Oh, the last thing I wanted to say about association tracts is they're going to help us link sensory information to memory centers. And so the way that this sort of works is if you put your hand in your pocket and you know that you have your keys in your pocket, your hand senses the feeling of those keys as you're like reaching for them and you touch them. That information gets taken to the brain. The brain is going to register that you are feeling something hard and cold, right? The memory centers of your brain are then going to be activated to sort of remind you of what that feeling is. Like, oh, we felt this before. We know that those are keys. And so we're linking something that's stored in a different part of the brain to the sensory component. So we sense it or we see it, we can name it, we can imagine it, we know what it is. So that's going to be the role of these association tracts. So since we've just talked about the white matter of the cerebrum, we now need to talk about the gray matter. So our gray matter is going to be the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, and the limbic system. Those are going to be our three major gray matter components to the cerebrum. So the gray matter is going to be the part that's actually carrying out sort of all of our integration of information and making of the decisions, and then we're going to send that blueprint of how to respond down our white matter tracts and actually carry out a command. So, but the cerebral cortex is going to be doing our integrated piece. When we look at the cerebral cortex, we have two major types of neurons present there. They are going to be stellate cells or pyramidal cells, and we are going to talk about pyramidal cells again later. So I want to introduce them here so they're kind of tucked into the back of our brain. Overall, the cortex is only about 2 to 3 meters thick, and it accounts for about 40% of our brain mass. So we actually get quite a bit of mass out of the cerebral cortex. Most of the cerebral mass, so a majority of the cerebral mass, is going to be composed of white matter. So we always talk about gray matter, as sort of a more general colloquial term that we use to talk about our brains and how awesome they are. But really, most of the brain is white matter. So again, the cortex, 2 to 3 millimeters thick, 40% of brain mass, but it does contain between 14 and 16 billion neurons, primarily in stellate and pyramidal cells. So our stellate cells, I'm going to point us over here. So this is going to be our brain, right? A section of our brain. This is the surface of the brain, and then this is getting deeper. This down here is going to be white matter. So all of this is sort of gray matter, and then down here we have our white matter. You can see that we have pyramidal cells, stellate cells, and then pyramidal cells. We actually divide the cortex of the brain into the neocortex, which is 6 different layers, which is what we're seeing here. And so we can sort of see the different organization in each of these layers. I don't want to get too deep into this, but I did want to define our different cell types. So our stellate cells are going to have sort of spherical bodies, so they're much more round. The somas themselves are round, and they tend to have a lot of dendrites that project off around them. So we can see here all of these purple, those are going to be our dendrites. They are going to have a priority for local sensory input and information processing. So what's going on around them, and they are going to process that information. The pyramidal cells, on the other hand, and I think one of the big things is that they are local. Local means that they stay within the gray matter. So they do not have axons that branch out and go anywhere else. They simply stay in the gray matter and sort of pass information around in their very specific area. The pyramidal cells, on the other hand, they do have axons that pass out of the white matter, or pass out of the gray matter and into the white matter. They are the only neurons that are going to leave the cortex. So our stellate cells stay in the cortex tissue. Actually, so the pyramidal cells leave the cortex. They are ultimately going to be our output neurons. So they're going to take our information from the cerebral cortex and carry it to another region. So they are our output neurons. When we look at them sort of from an anatomical standpoint, they have sort of, they almost look like diamonds, or I guess pyramidal, right? So they kind of look like these pyramids. And then they have many sort of dendrites and these really, really long axons that are going to carry down those white matter tracks. Okay, so we again are going to talk about our pyramidal cells again. I just wanted to point out that we have our stellate cells that do not leave the cortex, and they're involved in sort of passing information within the cortex region. And then we have pyramidal cells, which are going to carry information from structure to structure within the brain or out to the spinal cord. So we've done a little bit of talking or mentioning of the limbic system. The limbic system is going to be a ring of cortex that is on the medial side of each hemisphere, so towards the middle, right down that sulcus in the middle of our brain, longitudinal sulcus. It does encircle the corpus callosum and the thalamus, so we can see here all of this in purple is going to be part of the limbic system. Again, if we want to orient ourselves in here, we're going to have our thalamus. Here's that corpus callosum, so that white matter tract. What else should I point out? Back there is our pituitary gland. All of this is sort of this interconnected loop of fiber tract that is going to result in our feelings of emotion as well as involved in learning. So we might not think that those two are together, but we can sort of think of emotions as being either pleasure or reward based or unpleasant, right? And so those would be gratification and aversion, which is going to help teach us whether we should or should not do something again, right? So emotion and learning are going to be part of this limbic system. So we do have quite a few components here, and we've actually already talked about them. Obviously, there's a lot sort of labeled on here. We did say that the mammillary body was involved, so that's going to be part of the hypothalamus. We do have thalamic nuclei here that are going to be involved in the limbic system. The amygdala is a major one. We do have basal nuclei that are involved. We have the hippocampus is another big one. And then the cingulate gyrus is going to be, these three are going to be the three that I'm going to add to our understanding here. We're not going to talk necessarily about all of the things on here, although we are getting close at this point. So the cingulate gyrus is going to be one of these ridges, right? And it's a very obvious one. It's one that, again, we see consistently across people that arches over the top of the corpus callosum, and it is part of the frontal lobe as well as the parietal lobe. So it's actually this line right here, this whole big ridge that goes all the way around the corpus callosum. That's going to be our cingulate gyrus. We have the hippocampus, which is going to be medial to our temporal lobes, which is in here. And then we also have the amygdala, which is going to be rostral to the hippocampus. So there's the amygdala, there's the hippocampus, and there's our cingulate gyrus. So sort of the combination of these components plus some of the others we've talked about, again, are going to be heavily involved in our understanding of gratification and aversion. So gratification would be our sense of reward or pleasure, and aversion is going to be involved in unpleasant sensations such as fear or sorrow. Aversion is really dominantly linked to the amygdala. So the amygdala is very heavily involved in our feelings of aversion or our feelings of fear towards something. And the reason I'm mentioning this here, and again, we'll come back to this when we talk about our integrated brain functions, but the limbic system is going to be comprised of gray matter primarily. Okay, and the very last thing that we need to talk about in terms of gray matter are going to be our basal nuclei. So our basal nuclei are going to be our really sort of deep gray matter pieces that are surrounded by white matter. They tend to be lateral to our thalamus. There are, again, a number of them. We're going to focus on just a couple, and so collectively, we call them the corpus striatum. Individually, that would be, and so we can see it over here. This is where we're looking. We have the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. Are going to be these three, and so we can, here's one, and here's one. We can see these are, again, sort of those deep gray matter. They're surrounded by white matter. Heavily involved in motor control is sort of our big thing here. And so, again, when we're talking about how do we actually make a plan to respond to a stimulus that results or involves motor control, when we're talking about higher brain functions, we will come back to these. So I just wanted to point out where those are in here, and sort of their general location and structure. Okay, so this lecture has gone on long enough. I'm going to stop here. We're going to come back to integrated brain functions, and I will talk to you soon.